Produce and dairy are the two grocery categories that spoil fastest, which makes them the two categories where you bought the matters almost as much as what you bought. A perfect-looking strawberry or a sealed yogurt cup can still be a bad buy if it's spent even a few hours somewhere it shouldn't have. I'm not here to make you afraid of fruit and milk. They're two of the best things you can put in a cart. This video is 10 places and situations where the odds of getting wilted, spoiled, or genuinely unsafe produce and dairy go up significantly, based on straightforward cold chain logic, not paranoia. We're counting down from 10 to number 1, and number 1 isn't a specific place at all. It's a single red flag that applies everywhere, every time, no matter how nice the store looks. Quick ground rule before we start. Almost none of this is about entire categories of stores being bad. It's about specific conditions, broken cold chains, low turnover, no real refrigeration, that could show up almost anywhere if the wrong corner gets cut. Learn the pattern, not just the place. The single fastest test that applies across this whole list, worth knowing before we even get to number 10. Put a hand on the case itself, not just the product. A case that's genuinely cold to the touch is doing its job regardless of the store around it. And one that feels barely cool is a warning sign no matter how nice everything else looks. We'll cover the same 3 things for every entry on this list. What the actual risk is, why it happens in that specific setting, and the one thing worth checking before anything perishable goes in your cart. One more thing worth saying up front. Buying smart here isn't just a safety issue, it's a money issue too. Spoiled produce and dairy thrown away a day or 2 after purchase is money spent for nothing, which makes every item on this list a savings tip as much as a safety one. Let's get into it. A pre-made sandwich or a bottle of milk from a gas station cooler for emergency isn't the end of the world, but as a regular source for produce or dairy, these coolers have real problems that a grocery store's dedicated case doesn't. Those coolers get opened constantly by people grabbing sodas and energy drinks, which means the internal temperature swings far more than a dairy case built specifically to hold a steady cold. Milk and soft cheese are exactly the products least forgiving of that kind of swing. There's also a turnover problem. A gas station sells nowhere near the volume of milk or produce a grocery store does, so what's sitting on that shelf may have been there far longer than the date on it implies, especially with no one specifically rotating stock the way a grocery dairy department does daily. If it's genuinely the only option, shelf-stable versions, boxed milk, dried fruit, are the safer bet over anything perishable sitting in that inconsistent cooler. The staffing reason behind this is simple. A convenience store's core job is fuel and quick snacks, and nobody's role there is specifically built around checking a dairy case temperature log or rotating produce before it turns. It's not a knock on the staff. It's just not what the job was designed around. Produce at a gas station has the same turnover problem in a different form. A handful of bananas or apples by the register usually isn't restocked with any real frequency. So what's there on a random Tuesday could easily be the same stock that was there the previous week. Dollar stores and small discount chains have genuinely expanded into groceries in a lot of areas, and dry goods there could be a real bargain. Their produce and dairy sections are a different story, and usually a much smaller, more recent addition to the business. The produce selection is typically tiny compared to a real grocery store, which means slower turnover on every single item. A small bin of apples sitting for 2 weeks moves a lot slower than the same bin at a full grocery store selling hundreds of pounds a day. Refrigeration equipment is also a real cost difference. A small format store often runs older, smaller cooling units that weren't originally designed for the volume of dairy now being pushed through them, which means less consistent temperatures than a purpose-built supermarket dairy case. None of this means every dollar store product is bad. It means the odds shift, and it's worth actually looking closely at anything perishable there rather than assuming the same quality control as a full grocery store. If the produce looks genuinely fresh and the dairy case feels properly cold to the touch, there's no reason to avoid it. The point is to actually check, not to skip the aisle on principle. The dry goods and canned aisles at these same stores are usually a completely different story, worth noting separately. Shelf-stable products don't have a cold chain or fast turnover requirement, which is exactly why discount stores tend to be genuinely good value there, while their perishable sections need the extra scrutiny. An open-air stand selling firm vegetables like potatoes or squash is one thing. Those hold up fine at ambient temperature for a day. A stand selling berries, leafy greens, milk, or cheese with no shade, no ice, and no cooler is a genuinely different risk category, no matter how local or fresh it's advertised as. Delicate produce loses quality fast in direct heat. Berries can visibly break down within an hour or two in full sun, and leafy greens wilt on a similar timeline. That's a freshness problem more than a safety one, but it means you're often paying fresh market prices for produce that's already past its best hour. Dairy and uncooled stand is the bigger concern. Milk and soft cheese left between roughly 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit sit in the exact zone where bacteria multiplies fastest, and an afternoon in the sun with no cooling is genuinely enough time for that to matter. The fix is simple and easy to spot. Look for shade, a cooler, or visible ice specifically under the dairy and delicate produce, not just a table in direct sun. A stand that's thought about this usually shows it plainly. Timing matters here too. The same stand at 9 in the morning and the same stand at 3 in the afternoon on a hot day can be genuinely different risk levels, even with identical setup. Worth shopping the delicate items early if the option exists. Self-serve salad bars, cut fruit stations, and bulk bins are convenient, but they depend entirely on staff actually maintaining them. Refilling from cold storage regularly, keeping ice underneath topped off, and not leaving the same tray sitting out for hours past its window. Pre-cut fruit specifically is worth extra caution. Cutting through the skin exposes the inside to whatever bacteria was on the surface and on the knife, and once that's happened, refrigeration timing matters even more than it does for whole produce. Community scoops in bulk bins are a smaller but real cross-contamination risk too. A scoop that's been dropped, left in the wrong bin, or handled by dozens of shoppers a day isn't sterile, even if the product itself is fine. The tell to look for is simple. Does the display actually feel cold? Is the ice fresh and not melted to slush? And does the tray look recently refilled rather than picked over and sitting? If any of those are off, it's worth skipping that specific bin rather than the whole store. Olive bars and cheese counters with community tongs or scoops follow the same logic as bulk bins. The equipment itself is the variable, not the food, and a store that keeps utensils clean and dedicated per item is a genuinely different experience from one that doesn't. This one isn't about the store being bad. Warehouse clubs generally have excellent turnover and real refrigeration. The problem is entirely on the buying side. A gallon jug of milk or a 5-pound tub of yogurt is only a good deal if it actually gets eaten before it turns. A single person or small household buying the same jumbo size a large family buys is often just moving the spoilage from the store shelf to their own refrigerator. The product doesn't go bad any slower just because it's sealed in a bigger container. The math that actually matters here is simple. Divide the total volume by how much a household genuinely eats in the time before it spoils, and compare that price per usable unit against a smaller container elsewhere, not just the sticker price per pound. For anything with a short shelf life, soft cheese, fresh berries, pre-cut produce, the smaller container from a regular grocery store is very often the actual better deal once the wasted portion is accounted for honestly. The exception that makes warehouse club dairy genuinely worth it. Items that freeze well, like shredded cheese or butter, since portioning and freezing on the day of purchase turns a bulk size into a long-term deal instead of a race against the clock. Flea markets and informal roadside sellers occasionally offer dairy, raw milk, homemade cheese, cream, with no label, no inspection stamp, and no visible cold storage. This is a genuinely different category from a licensed farm stand or a regulated farmer's market vendor. Unpasteurized dairy carries real, well-documented risk regardless of who's selling it or how it's stored, and that risk goes up substantially when there's also no refrigeration and no way to know how long it's been sitting since it was made. A legitimate small dairy producer at a real farmer's market will typically have visible licensing, proper cold storage, and clear labeling. The absence of all three at an informal stall is the actual signal here, not the setting itself. Eggs and firm cheeses from a genuine, licensed small producer are usually a completely different and much safer story. This caution is specifically about unlabeled, uncooled dairy from a seller who can't or won't answer basic questions about it. Simply asking a couple of direct questions, how it's stored, when it was made, whether it's pasteurized, tells you almost everything you need to know. A legitimate seller answers immediately and specifically, while vague or evasive answers are worth treating as a decline on their own. Fresh produce and dairy vending machines are a real, growing category. An apple, a salad cup, or a small yogurt from a machine instead of a shelf. The convenience is genuine, but the refrigeration and rotation depend entirely on how well that specific machine is serviced. A well-maintained machine in a hospital or office building can be perfectly fine. The risk is a machine that's serviced infrequently, in a location without much foot traffic, meaning products can sit for a genuinely long time before anyone restocks or removes anything past its date. There's no way to ask an employee whether the machine was just restocked, which is the one real disadvantage compared to a staff cooler. You're relying entirely on the machine's own posted date and how cold it visibly feels through the glass. If you use one regularly, it's worth noticing whether the same items seem to sit for days versus genuinely rotating. That's the clearest sign of whether a specific machine is being properly serviced. Location is a genuinely useful shortcut here. A machine inside a busy office, hospital, or gym tends to get serviced far more often than one in a low-traffic hallway or a rest stop, simply because the operator's visit schedule is usually tied to how fast the machine sells through. Grocery delivery from a real store, packed and shipped by that store, generally handles cold chain properly. A third-party marketplace listing from an individual reseller shipping dairy or fresh produce directly is a different and much less predictable situation. An individual seller shipping perishables has no guaranteed cold chain once the package leaves their hands. No refrigerated truck, no guaranteed delivery window, and often minimal insulation, especially if the listing doesn't specifically mention ice packs or cold shipping. A package that sat on a porch for several hours in the heat before being brought and has effectively broken the cold chain regardless of how it was packed initially. This is as much about what happens after delivery as what the seller did before shipping. If buying perishables through any online marketplace, checking for explicit mention of insulated packaging and ice packs, and being home to receive the package promptly meaningfully lowers the risk, buying blind from a listing with no shipping detail does not. Tracking the delivery window and arranging to be home, rather than letting a perishable package sit on a porch for an unknown number of hours, is the single biggest variable an individual buyer actually controls in this entire situation. This one happens inside completely normal, reputable grocery stores. A bin or shelf of yogurt, berries, or milk marked down because it's close to its date. The discount itself is a genuinely good thing. The mistake is grabbing from that bin without actually looking at each item. Clearance bins get handled more than regular shelf stock. Customers pick through them, put items back, and containers get knocked around, which means the odds of a compromised seal or a leaking container are meaningfully higher than on the regular shelf, even though most of what's there is completely fine. The habit that fixes this is simple. Check the seal on every dairy container from a clearance bin specifically, and produce a quick look for any spot that started a breakdown, rather than grabbing on autopilot, because the price is good. Done with that one extra check, clearance bins are genuinely one of the best values in the whole store. This is about buying smart from them, not avoiding them. Anything from a clearance bin that passes the seal check but is genuinely close to its date is also a great freezing candidate. Yogurt, shredded cheese, and even some berries freeze reasonably well, turning a deep discount into a much longer window before it needs to be used. And at number 1, the single biggest red flag there is, and the one thing that applies in every single place on this entire list: a dairy container with a compromised seal or produce packaging that's been opened and not properly resealed. A broken seal means the product has been exposed to air and whatever bacteria was on the outside of that seal, and there is no way to know just by looking how long ago that happened or what the product was exposed to in the meantime. This is exactly why the other 9 places on this list matter. A broken seal is more likely to slip through unnoticed somewhere with low turnover, poor lighting, or no one specifically checking, which is the actual thread connecting every item on this countdown. Lighting is a genuinely underrated factor here too. A dim stand, a poorly lit clearance bin, or a shadowed corner of a market makes a compromised seal or a soft spot on produce much easier to miss than the same flaw under the bright, even lighting of a well-run grocery aisle. The same logic extends to any produce clamshell or bag that's been opened and left resealed loosely, or a container that shows a puncture, dent, or crack. None of these are worth the risk of the discount, no matter how good a store's reputation otherwise is. A quick smell test is worth adding to the seal check specifically for dairy. It costs nothing, takes 1 second, and catches the rare case where something looks completely fine but has already started to turn, a habit worth keeping even on products bought from the most trustworthy source on this entire list. The single habit that covers every place on this list, every time. Check the seal before it goes in the cart, not after you're already home. That 1 second of checking is what actually protects you, far more than which specific store or stand you're standing in. So there you have it. 10 places and situations where the odds of a bad produce or dairy buy go up, from a solid caution at gas station coolers to the one universal red flag that matters everywhere: a broken seal. Notice the pattern running through this entire list. Almost none of it is really about specific stores being untrustworthy. It's about cold chain, turnover, and whether someone is actually checking, and those 3 things can be good or bad almost anywhere. A few habits cover most of this at once. Feel whether a case is actually cold. Notice how picked over or fresh a display looks. And check every seal before it goes in the cart. 3 checks that take seconds and apply everywhere on this list simultaneously. Worth saying plainly too, none of these 10 are rare, exotic situations. Most people run into at least a few of them regularly, which is exactly why a handful of quick habits matter more here than trying to memorize which specific stores to avoid. None of this is about being afraid of fresh food. It's about buying it with the same basic awareness you'd already use for anything else that can go bad, so the produce and dairy that make it into your cart are actually the good ones. And the money side of this is worth restating on the way out. Every one of these checks takes seconds, and every one of them is also directly protecting the money already spent on that item. A habit that pays for itself the very first time it catches something before it makes it home. Once these checks become automatic, they stop feeling like extra work at all. They turn into the same quick glance you already give a carton of eggs or a bag of chips, just applied a little more consistently to the 2 categories most worth that extra second. If this helps you shop smarter, hit subscribe. New pantry and grocery smart videos almost every day. Real numbers, no fear-mongering. And tell me in the comments, which one of these 10 surprised you the most? Stay stocked, stay smart, and I'll see you in the next one.